Okay, we're going to talk about back muscles and answer the questions: what is the difference between superficial and deep back muscles? And what are the superficial back muscles and what are their actions in innervation? And what are the deep back muscles and what are their actions in innervation? Okay, so what's the difference between superficial back muscles and deep back muscles? And so here we have a picture of the back, and we're going to take a cross section through, and we're going to see this cross section. We blow that up, and this is a cross section of the trunk through the scapula. And a few things. So there are the scapulae highlighted, and there's the vertebra, a vertebra highlighted. And so in green are superficial back muscles. They're superficially located. And in orange, there are the deep back muscles. So superficial back muscles, they arise from the axial skeleton. There's a vertebra. And then they're going to course and insert on the scapula, and in one case, the humerus. And so there's our scapula. And so superficial back muscles support and move the upper limb. That's their primary action. And they're innervated by ventral rami for the most part. Now, in contrast, the deep back muscles are right beside the vertebral column. There's a vertebra. And their function or purpose is to support and move the vertebral column, and their innervation is through the dorsal rami. So let's go through each of those. So let's start with superficial back muscles and traps, levator, rhomboids, and our latissimus dorsi muscles. So let's go through each one of these. So our trapezius muscle, which is right there, is highlighted there in orange, and I've kind of drawn it on so it's not dissected like the picture. And let's talk about briefly their attachments. And so the trapezius arises from the back of the skull from the external occipital protuberance, and then has this midline attachment all the way down to the T12 spinous process. And then laterally, it's going to insert on the scapula all along the spine, including the acromion and lateral third of the clavicle. And so the trapezius has the following actions. Well, before I talk about the different actions, let's talk about the three fiber orientations of the trapezius. There are these upper fibers, there are middle fibers, and there are the lower fibers. And these three fiber orientation lets us see the different actions. So there we have this picture of the superficial back. There's our scapula, and then we're going to ghost on the trapezius muscle, and those three blue dots along the spine of the scapula show our three fiber orientations: the upper fibers, the middle fibers, and the lower fibers. And so the upper fibers of the trapezius, when they contract, help with elevating the scapula like this, like shrugging the shoulders. So we call that elevation of the scapula, or shrugging your shoulders. Now the middle fibers there, when they contract, they're going to then cause the scapula to move towards the vertebral column. We call that adduction of the scapula, or retraction. And then finally, the lower fibers, when they contract, depress the scapula. So to do that, let's have the scapula elevated, and now we see the contraction. When they do this, we call this depression of the scapula. So when all the fibers are working together, you see those blue dots represent the attachments on the spine of the scapula. The upper fibers, middle fibers, and lower fibers are going to then show a depression and an elevation, and so they kind of make a pivot. So when we see this, watch what happens. Shing! Like that. You see how it upwardly rotates the scapula. So we call that upward rotation of the scapula when all those fibers are working together. So there's the trapezius. Now the innervation of the trapezius is via this nerve we see on the deep side of the traps. It's called the spinal accessory nerve, or it's a cranial nerve, so cranial nerve number 11. XI is the Roman numeral for 11. And there's our spinal accessory nerve coursing on the deep side of the traps. So other superficial back muscles include the levator scapulae muscle. And so the levator scapulae muscle that I've ghosted in deep to our splenius muscle attaches from the vertebral column all the way down to the superior angle of the scapula. And this muscle, when it contracts, its action is to lift the scapula, and it works synergistically with the trapezius, and so it elevates, or the elevation of the scapula, hence the name levator elevator scapula muscle. The next one are the rhomboid major and minor muscles. And so there we have a rhombus. And so anatomists love geometry. So they look at these muscles like, ooh, it makes a rhombus. So we're going to then call these muscles the rhomboid muscles, or a rhombus, because they make that shape. Geometry. And so the attachments of the rhomboid muscles, the major and minor, from C7 and spinous processes down to T4, and that's the medial attachment. And laterally, they're going to attach all along that medial margin of the scapula, so that when these muscles contract, they bring the scapula towards the midline, so they act synergistically with the traps, and we call that adduction or retraction of the scapula. And so the innervation now of the levator scapulae and rhomboid minor and rhomboid major muscles are going to be, we can see those three muscles on the picture, is through a common nerve called the dorsal scapular nerve, which arises from the C5 spinal cord level. And so we put a motor neuron in that ventral horn gray matter, and then we take a look and see that motor neuron course and go deep to those muscles and then innervate each one of them. There's our dorsal scapular nerve. Now, neurons just don't float in outer space, so it actually has a pathway within this structure called the brachial plexus, which is a plexus of nerves that supply the upper limb or muscles that act on the upper limb. And those will be in greater detail in the upper limb section. Next is the latissimus dorsi muscle, where the word latissimus means broad and dorsal is back. It's a really broad muscle on the back. And so latissimus dorsi muscle, it's going to have attachments all along the vertebral column from spinous processes of T7 down to the sacrum. And then this aponeurotic fascia called the thoracolumbar fascia. It's going to then insert in the intertubercular groove of the humerus. And so this muscle, its actions are as follows. It's going to, one of them, we see this where you're adducting the humerus. We call adduction of the humerus as if doing a chin-up. You can also see an action of this muscle, which is in this movement here, and we call that extension of the humerus. And so extension of the humerus and adduction of the humerus are the big movements or actions. So innervation of latissimus dorsi is through our thoracodorsal nerve, which arises from the C6, C7, and C8 spinal cord levels. So we have motor neurons that arise in the ventral horn from each of those levels, and then the axons course out, and each of these segmental levels, and they form one nerve called the thoracodorsal nerve. And this thoracodorsal nerve, because it innervates a muscle of the upper limb, is going to be found in this structure again called the brachial plexus, coming off that posterior cord. So we're going to talk more about the brachial plexus in the upper limb. Okay, so now let's go into deep back muscles. These are the intrinsic back muscles, like the splenius, capitis, and cervicus. They're erector spinae and transversal spinalis muscles. And our focus is going to be on muscle groups and their individual muscles, their primary actions, and the innervation, not so much on the attachments. And so the deep back muscles are also known as the intrinsic back muscles. Why? Because the word intrinsic is Latin for interior or inner or within, because in orange we can see those intrinsic back muscles, which are interior of the back or inner within. But the deep back muscles are also known as paraspinal muscles because that prefix para means beside and spinal means the spine, so that when we take a look at this, we're like, oh, look, these muscles are beside the spine. And how about one more? How about epaxial muscles as well? They have an embryological origin in these deep back muscles because when we take a look at the somite, this periaxial mesoderm that condenses beside the neural tube, the somite gives rise to sclerotomes, dermatomes, and myotomes. And the myotomes give rise to hypomeres that make the anterior lateral body wall muscles and limb muscles, and the epimere, which makes the muscles epi upon the back of this developing embryo. And so the epimere gives rise to epaxial muscles, which are also known as your deep back muscles. So I was all just saying that deep back muscles are also known as intrinsic, paraspinal, or epaxial muscles. Now, of those deep back muscles, we're going to talk about the splenius muscles. So the splenius muscles, splenius capitis and splenius cervicis, they're going to arise from the vertebral column, and then they're going to insert on the back of the skull and back of the mastoid process. And their actions bilaterally are posture. They're going to basically keep your head straight or your neck straight. They also bilaterally contract, are going to do that movement, which is showing neck extension. There's neck extension. The erector spinae muscles are next, and there's three of them, the iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinalis muscles. And so the erector spinae muscles, first iliocostalis, when we take a look, and we're going to outline that iliocostalis in this picture, and it arises from the ilium and goes to the ribs, segmentally attaching up on the ribs. And so hence the name ilio for ilium and costalis for ribs. The next is longissimus, and so here we're going to highlight where that longissimus goes all the way up, and I added this because in this illustration we didn't have its most distal attachment. So there we have the entire longissimus muscle, and it arises from the vertebral column and then segmentally attaches to ribs and ultimately goes to the mastoid process in the back of the skull. And so why is it called the longissimus? Well, because it's the longest muscle in the back. That's why. Then we have the spinalis muscle that we're going to highlight right here. There's our spinalis muscle, and this muscle is going to arise from spinous processes, and it attaches to these spinous processes right along the midline of the back. So here we have the erector spinae muscles. I, ilicostalis, L, longissimus, S, spinalis, or I love sarsaparilla. Okay. The actions of the erector spinae muscles are as follows. I mean, these have a lot of postural movements, and so I've just ghosted in there these muscles and their posture. They keep the spine erect. And so we think of this term erector spinae, literally means keep the spine, erector spinae, that literally means keep the spine erect. Now, bilateral contraction is vertebral extension as well, where they not only isometrically contract. So when we take a look at this, the erector spinae muscles isometrically contract to keep the spine erect. There's no movement. But when they concentrically contract, it results in vertebral extension from here to here, and then even to hyperextension. And unilaterally contraction, if only one side contracts, as you can see here, or here, it results in lateral flexion. So the erector spinae muscles' actions are posture, vertebral extension, and lateral vertebral flexion. The transversal spinalis muscles are then, if we then outline the erector spinae, then we take a scalpel and go shing, and we then cut those muscles out. The deeper muscles are those transversal spinalis muscles. And you might be saying, hey, Dr. Morton, why are they called transversal spinalis muscles? Because, I'm glad you asked that question, these muscles arise from a transverse process and insert on a spinous process, spinalis. Hence the name transversospinalis muscles. Now, individually, that's the collective term. Individually, transversal spinalis includes semispinalis, rotatories, and multifidus, those three muscles. And so what are the actions of these muscles? They maintain posture. They have a little bit of rotation, but most of the rotation of the vertebral column is through your anterior abdominal wall muscles like external oblique and such. So transversal spinalis are good for posture. Now, what about the innervation of these deep back muscles, the splenius, erector spinae, and transversal spinalis muscles? They are segmentally innervated by dorsal rami. What does that mean? Well, here we have an outline of where those deep back muscles are. And so the dorsal ramus arises and provides motor innervation to all the deep back muscles at each segmental level. So bilaterally, and I just show one segmental level and one side, the dorsal rami innervates the part of these longitudinally oriented muscles at that level. Now, to recap of back muscles overview, the superficial back muscles, all listed there, they support and move the upper limb, and they're primarily innervated by ventral rami, except trapezius, which is by that spinal accessory nerve. And the deep back muscles, they're listed there, basically support and move the vertebral column, and they're innervated by dorsal rami. And that is a recap, my friends, of the back muscles.